So there's this real lack of consensus about what kids should know and be able to do when they graduate ready for college and careers. But I think everyone can agree that kids certainly need to have academic skills as well as the non-cognitive skills that are important for today's workplace. We already have measures in place for academic achievement and mechanisms like data-informed instruction to help drive those measures. Mike Ilniak and I have felt that we need a balancing metric, a non-cognitive metric, and we've chosen student agency. This is our inquiry into the student-centered practices that unleash intrinsic motivation to drive agency and academic achievement for students. To jumpstart our work, I've spoken with experts and practitioners and teachers and thought leaders about the cultures and the practices and the pedagogies that drive academic outcomes and agency for students.
I love the term agency, although not everyone knows what we're talking about. When I wrote Getting Smart 5 years ago, I said that this digital revolution that we're part of was going to improve customization, motivation, and equalization, that it held the potential that every student could have a customized learning path, and that we'd be able to unlock the real key, student motivation, and that if we did it with equity in mind, that all boats could rise, that we could really not only help struggling students do much better, but that we could blow the top off with kids ready to learn. You and I have seen many low agency environments. You could call them high compliance environments. It's really most of American schools. It's most Eastern schools as well. The high performing countries of Korea, Taiwan, slightly less so Singapore these days, but they're generally high compliance schools. And in a high compliance school, there's obvious benefits to a high compliance school. Kids don't screw around, they sit in rows, they behave, they do what you tell them to do. And we know a high compliance school can create relatively high levels of rote learning, where kids can memorize and regurgitate. They learn the rules and they're spoon-fed. But I don't think I've ever seen a high compliance environment that actually promoted deep learning.
Measures. So for me, intrinsic motivation is at the core of learning and should be. If you look at all the classic quotations on education, I think that's basically, the intent of so many very sort of thoughtful and wise people in describing what happens to individuals. They become more educated. I mean, I think the less that we see intrinsic motivation as a part of that process, the more that we're actually talking about education as social control. So, I think this is a really interesting topic, right? Because we use the language of self-direction, but we have this sort of dichotomy. It's the difference between the Socratic view of bringing out the best in each individual and the Platonic Republic view, right, of the state determining what students need to know in order for the students to serve the state. And I think there's a dilemma there. I mean, we have an inherent dilemma about whether or not we believe that we're a collective of individuals, and individual strength makes the society stronger, or if we're a collective and the individuals are secondary to that. And it's not a small dilemma, right? It really has a lot of impact in terms of how we think about moving forward. We talk about being competitive, that schooling helps our nation become competitive. And it's hard to imagine that that's the case if students aren't actually individually competent and capable and then working together to figure things out.
Like, I'm not sitting here saying that all this maker stuff is this brand new thing that you should try. It's like, no, it connects deeply to exactly the right things, the things we know about learning, that if you read John Dewey, John Holt, Maria Montessori, Piaget, Seymour Papert, all these people said exactly the same thing. They're all talking about kids doing real things that matter to them. I think I want to dispel the myth that this is about lazy teachers. This is about, teachers just sitting back and the kids do at what they discover everything. And it's like, that's so crazy. People have these weird ideas. It's like, over here on one side, there's kids like wandering barefoot through the fields and their hair uncombed, and they stumble across the Pythagorean theorem, and oh my God, they're little geniuses, And then on the other hand, there's like kids sitting in rows with teachers lecturing at them. It's like, there's so much in between. Well, I think that anytime you can give kids a link to the real world, make them understand that things are relevant, put them in the driver's seat, that is motivating. It's intrinsically motivating because they're the ones that are thinking of these things. They're the ones who are having ideas. And, the fun part of being on the cutting edge is nobody's an expert, right? The teachers who were doing 3D printers and, adding the Internet of Things to the classroom were like, well, I don't know, let's figure it out, which is an incredibly powerful stance for a teacher to model that being a learner who's open to anything. And hey, guess what? It's true. This stuff is all so new. Nobody's an expert. It's a fantastic opportunity. And I think a lot of teachers who are excited by the maker movement are feeling their own professional lives renewed. And they're seeing something that's just so fantastic and so fun. They feel energized, and that can't help but do good things for their classrooms. I think that in the face of the world changing, we need kids to be part of this revolution. For a long time, for a lot of times, schools look at kids as objects of change. What are we going to do to them? How are we going to teach them? How are we going to tell them what to do? How are we going to make their learning happen? And kids should be the agents of change. And what happens when a kid exceeds everyone's expectations, including their own, is just a miracle. And when I talk to kids and they say, I see the world differently, they sound like artists, they sound like engineers, because that's how people who know they can make a difference talk. And when
Story provides opportunities for students to think more deeply about important content. That would be sort of the big picture ideas that are embedded within state standards. The process really fosters intellectual rigor and builds a depth of understanding of content that we don't see students getting through a traditional lecture or practice pedagogy. So if you want to get to potentially 2x student learning, we don't believe that it can happen without this kind of shift in the classroom. So we were really curious why we thought the students were doing so well, and we didn't do any kind of test prep. So the teachers were not doing any very specific MEP preparations before the testing, the format or test questions and so on. So we're like, how are these students really achieving at such high levels? And when we talked to the students, what they said was really fascinating. They said, the test is so easy because they give you all the answers. They give you all the answers. So if you think about the way a standardized test is usually written, it's multiple choice. All the answers are there on the page. You just have to pick the best one, or you have to pick the correct one in most cases. So for our students, they had been used to really grappling deeply with the content. It seemed so simple for them to just simply pick out which was the best answer.
Like I mentioned, blended learning is really an enabler of personalized learning. And I think that really gets at a number of needs of students in terms of their needs as learners. First of all, blended learning allows you to shift away from the factory model classroom where, in the traditional learning setting, you have a fixed pace of instruction and a fixed sequence of instruction. So students are grouped by age, and then they move through the same sequence of units and courses. And it's kind of a sink or swim kind of environment where some students rise to the top and they're your A students, and other students struggle. And just the reality of that model is that it can't adapt to students' individual learning needs. So blended learning is still an evolving area. So there isn't a blueprint that says, here is how you do blended learning. from start to finish. Just take this and hand it to your teachers and let them run with it, and it's all going to work great?
I think it starts with student engagement. If we don't have students who show up with curiosity and who want to be there in the learning experience, it's an uphill battle all the way. And beyond being an uphill battle, we know from research that we have a real engagement problem in schools today. The longer, according to the Gallup Hope surveys, the longer students spend in school, the less engaged they feel. It's just a downward graph. And it's kind of dispiriting if you're thinking about what sorts of adults are we trying to prepare for the world ahead. Don't we want curious people who feel like they can take hold of problems, figure out solutions, and manage their own learning? I think that's what we need. Project-based learning takes hold when teachers have time to collaborate with each other, time to dig in and experience a different kind of curriculum design, different strategies for teaching and learning than they even got to experience as learners themselves. They need a little time for that to settle in, for them to get comfortable with that, to kind of get their sea legs with that. But when that's in place, when teachers have that time for collaborative professional development, for inquiry of their own about, what makes for good PBL, they get to kind of start to feel it almost at a gut level of, now I know what it's like to be a learner in this context. That's when we see project-based learning taking hold. And we also see in those contexts teacher satisfaction increasing. So not only do we get, great outcomes for kids, we know that kids are mastering the core content through PBL, they're doing as well or better on the standardized tests, engagement increases, all those good things are happening, and teachers are liking their work better. And I often hear about examples of projects that extend after the grading period ends. So in other words, kids don't want to quit. They want to keep going. And I think that's the greatest indicator that, we've hit the sweet spot of really finding something that is compelling and motivating to students.
So again, I really like game-based learning because it promotes that exploration and experimentation with the text. Also, it's interested learning because it makes learning fun. So the word fun in the game design world refers to the experience of being able to wrestle with and solve complicated puzzles. Okay, so fun is not just, yay, I discovered something fun, and it's not quite that subjective. It's actually solving difficult puzzles. So games are fun by nature because they offer complexities.
One thing I've noticed, students feel confident in Minecraft because they play it for fun, and they've developed a skill set in Minecraft that they may not have in something else in school. So if there's a project that they're working on to where they may not know exactly what they're building, or they may not completely understand the math concept, by letting them do it in Minecraft, it gives them a sense of confidence going in on one portion of the assignment.
So as far as why they're important to the classroom is really one of the things that alternate reality games really do well is they create an epistemic frame from David Schaefer's literature, where basically you're looking for different pieces within the game or different aspects of a game that really relate to whatever skill set you're trying to have the students learn or master.
Is it because it's authentic? It's not about taking a multiple choice test. It's not about taking a short answer. It is about the student themselves solving the problem.
So you've got a cell phone or a tablet sitting on a desk in a classroom or sitting on a desk at home. That is not mobile learning, even though it's a mobile device. To me, mobile learning means any place, anytime, moving around is part of the learning experience itself. And by those standards, there isn't much mobile learning going on, unfortunately. I was one of 15 people who were the technical working group for the 2010 National Education Technology Plan, which attempted to sketch the difference between a 21st century learning environment and a 20th century industrial era learning environment. And one of the big differences was the idea of learning any place, anytime. That in 20th century learning, whether it's pre-college or post-secondary, there's a learning place and there's a learning time, and that's where learning is focused. And in the 21st century, just as in other parts of our lives, we don't segment ourselves into just one time slot or one particular place in order to do things. So I think that the big challenge in terms of 21st century learning is helping us get out of that school box that we put ourselves in, even though we have devices that could let us walk outside of it.
That, but I think it's really important that teachers and students feel that they are the ones that are really looking for the signs that students are making progress in the kinds of learning skills, strategies, and ideas that are trying to be accomplished within the class. I think too much of the assessment that we've been seeing recently in schools is really of interest only to outside agencies, people that are evaluating schools, and teachers, schools, children, families have become so fixated on these evaluative kind of data that they've they're spending too much time with that and not enough with really assessing what's going on day by day in the classroom. An analogy I use for this is going to the doctors. If you're ill and you go to the doctor and he makes or she makes all her decisions based on what your temperature is, you're not going to get a very good diagnosis about what to do with your symptoms. You really want to have more exhaustive diagnostic information, and that's really what embedded formative assessment does, is it gives the teacher diagnostic information that tells them what they should be doing next to help their students' learning.
So partly, so I think of how to change schools a lot from the inside out and from the outside in, and I'll take them both separately. Because there are many really, really smart and well-intentioned people trying to reform the school system and doing very interesting things like the flipped classroom, project-based learning, all sorts of different formative assessment. I don't know what. There's, using Minecraft to teach, doing maker work, all kinds of beautiful things. And I think it's awesome. The only problem is that almost all of them still live inside what's called the hidden curriculum of school, which means that the school's architecture and infrastructure and norms and rhythms are all designed for mistrust of you, the student. Well, I think if I ran a school, or I lived right next to a school and had some influence over the school, or something like that, or if a school were very brave, what they might do is stop school for a week, teach everybody the hidden curriculum of school, out the thing. Be very explicit about it, and then reorganize the school with the kids as full participants in a very democratic free school kind of way, and build systems and norms and processes, and effectively reappropriate the structures of the school in some new way.